Hey friends, you know how I love great podcasts, and I want you to check out the Code Newbie podcast. It's all about stories from folks on their coding journey. They talk to new developers, experienced developers, and everyone in between about how they got started learning to code, how they navigate their technical careers, and they also do deep dives into technical topics in a newbie-friendly way. Check out their podcast at www.codenewbie, that's NEWBIE.org/podcast. That's codenewbie.org/podcast. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Foone Turing. They're a computer program from the mountains of North Carolina that are now in the Bay Area, I believe. Is that right?
Yep.
And you have called yourself a software archivist. You've called yourself a software necromancer. But you work on modern software. Like your day job is to do software, but is your day job also to do old software? Is that that's your side hustle?
It's basically my side hustle. My day job involves a lot more modern stuff. Although I do backups, so it's like, you want to back up old stuff as well. So yeah, all the old software and hardware is definitely just a thing I do on the side, as a hobby.
It feels like more than a hobby, though. Like I like retro gaming, and my wife calls it a hobby, but it's kind of an obsession. What is it that made you so excited about the past?
So it's kind of I've explained this before. It's kind of a two-edged sword. Well, that makes it sound more negative than it is. But it's two main things. First of all, it's all the stuff that I kind of remember from the past that, is gone now. The old games, the old software, even stuff that wasn't that great to begin with, like, a particularly awkward, like Windows 3.1 program. It's just a lot of, very nostalgia to go back and play with it and see like, wow, this thing is terrible. Look how much they improved it in the later versions. And it's also like almost more than that, the stuff you didn't know about back then, or the stuff you knew about but never got to try. Like I remember, not having a ton of money back in the 90s when I was a kid, and looking through all the PC worlds and stuff, and they're like, here's the OS2 and the Windows NT, and it's like, well, I don't have any way to get those. I had to save up for like 8 months to get Windows 95, so I'm never going to get to play with those. But now it's totally possible to go find some old discs on eBay and build up an old computer and actually get to play with them. All the stuff you knew about but never got to try out. And then sort of the other side of that is all the stuff you didn't know about but existed back then. It's like I love finding out like, yeah, someone made this weird floppy drive that stores 24 megabytes and apparently sold all of 8 of them. It's like that kind of thing, or this weird software, these weird games that just didn't go anywhere and history kind of forgot until you uncover them. It's like, this seems like it should have been around, should have been bigger, but it just wasn't. So it's always fun to go back and look through it and sort of try to figure out where it fits into the history of computers and gaming and such.
Why is nostalgia such a drug? I recently went to the Microsoft archives and I just, I teared up a little bit. It just seems like it was just, is this what we're just doomed to look to the past and say, oh, it was so much better back in the day?
Kinda. Yeah, I think a lot of it is kind of, it's nice to see this sort of history put in a museum sort of thing, or it's like, it's like your own memories are kind of all jumbled up with, all the other stuff you were doing, going to school and, college and, going on dates and relationships, all that kind of stuff, just the sort of the complexity of life. In a museum, you can kind of put it into a coherent story where it's like, we made this and then customers didn't like this aspect, so we made this instead, or we made this, but then IBM made this instead and that was better than ours, so we had to come back with a better one. It's like it sort of takes history and makes it make sense by putting it all out and removing the complications. The other, I think,
I'm sorry, I was going to say that before you go, you tell stories. You're a storyteller. Like, I don't know if you think of yourself as this, but people think of you as this. You do these long, rambly threads, but you have these wonderful story arcs about things that happen or discoveries that you've made. So it seems like storytelling is kind of at the core of who you are.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not like a professional writer or anything, but I kind of try with this sort of thing. And I've had people who are professional writers be like, "Wow, this is really good. Have you made a book yet?" And I'm like, "No, I've never even tried." But thanks for the vote of confidence.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing about nostalgia is that it's really good for letting you get to something old and look at it only at the good parts. Because that's the thing is it's like you can easily look back at a time where it's like, yeah, the 80s. Man, the music was great. And then we also had like the Cold War. We had, all kinds of financial problems, like homophobia. It's like all these nasty things going on. But nostalgia kind of lets you refine it down to let's think about this era, this time, this place, but only the parts we want to experience again. We can go back and just listen to Duran Duran and not have to deal with all the trouble of being in the 80s. So that's kind of the nice thing is it's like it's nice to go back and play with like a Windows 95 machine because then you don't have to go to high school afterwards. You don't have to deal with all the other problems. It's just those good bits that were, in the sort of general mix of life.
That is the most perfect description of nostalgia. That is, you exactly made me understand why I felt like that going through the archives. And I was walking through there looking for old copies of Microsoft software. And of course, when I put this on TikTok, a bunch of people in the chat are like, burn it with fire and blah, 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 blah. People with like deep generational pain about things that they didn't like Microsoft doing in the early 90s. You've been trying to chase down Microsoft 3D Movie Maker for a while. This seems to be your windmill that you've been chasing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't know exactly how long. Like the number I've been giving is like 2 decades, but like one of my friends who's kind of been in this community as well was able to actually find a time in 2003 where he was emailing someone at Microsoft about this and got some feedback and was like, well, we'll see if we can look into it and kind of stuff. So it's like we've been looking at this for a while because I think the 3D Movie Maker has always had a very sort of devoted community. And it's fun because going back, you can kind of look and see sort of the inflection point where it's like in the 90s, we were like, yeah, we need to talk to Microsoft and see if we can, like petition them to make 3D Movie Maker 2. And then like as time went on, we're like, well, that's probably not going to happen. Maybe we'll make our own one or maybe we'll get the source. Kind of the views have changed, but there's kind of been a through line of this program is great. We want more. We need to either get Microsoft to help us make more or we need to make it ourselves. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
It seems like, every couple of years I would bump into you and I would email some people and I would make a run. And I talked to people internally and they'd say, oh yeah, I was talking to Foone and they asked me to. And I think Max Sample was looking into it for you. And a couple of folks named Sean were looking at it for you. Like you've got your fingers, kind of all throughout Microsoft. Everyone knows that Foone is looking for this copy of 3D Movie Maker. And then you had kind of a tweet go viral. Had you ever gotten that much attention from a simple request on Twitter for the source code for Movie Maker before?
No, not really. I mean, it kind of was just a sort of thing that I was, I would go back to from time to time, just sort of like I'd mention it because of something else. Like I can't even remember what it was. Something else someone was talking about, like, what would you do if you won $1 million kind of thing? And I was like, well, I'd go to Microsoft and say, here's $1 million. Can I buy 3D Movie Maker with this? Just, something else to kind of set me off. Because I've got ADHD and people like to think of ADHD as kind of the, can't concentrate on one thing kind of, condition. But it's also you can really, really, really concentrate on one thing sometimes. You just don't necessarily get to choose what that thing is. You kind of hyper focus. So it's like I have a lot of times where someone just sort of sets me off on an issue. Like the other day, someone brought up the Goodyear blimp again, and that's one of my pet peeves. I get really mad about the Goodyear blimp, and I just go off on like, no, it's not Goodyear, and it's not a blimp. It's named after Goodyear by some unrelated tire company, and it's a Zeppelin. It's that kind of thing. Or it's like just certain topics. I always am willing to talk about them. Like for years, I was yelling about the James Webb Space Telescope because like it's a project that started. It started before 3D Movie Maker was written, actually. That's how old it is. And it's like NASA's been working on this thing for like 25 years. And it's like they finally got it into space last year. It's like finally, just every year or two, I'd come up and be like, well, there's the James Webb ground device because it's sitting in a warehouse in Florida not getting launched, which is where space telescopes are supposed to be. That kind of thing. Where it's like, so 3D Movie Maker is one of those things. Like I mentioned before, like, if I ever look for a job, I know I can't work at Microsoft because the first thing they're going to do is type in Foone, Microsoft, and see me talking about, I need to get like 5 guys. Like we need a sniper. We need someone who can crack safes. We're going to sneak in there under the cover of darkness and steal their source code. It's like, we can't hire you because of all the industrial espionage you've threatened on multiple occasions. So it's just, it kind of became a joke that I was just going to do anything to get it. So I'm glad that something finally sort of caught on with the right people and got big.
Yeah, there were a couple of there's some fanfic of an Ocean's 14 where you we're putting together a team and then we break into Microsoft and steal this. So I'd made a couple runs and Mac would make a couple runs. People emails and we would get slapped down. But you had this tweet and it ended up getting 4,000 or 5,000 likes. So I screenshotted it And I sat down and I was like, how am I going to figure out? Like, I know we keep getting keep getting told no. What's the essence of the no? And the
Right.
no's that I looked at were never real no's. They were more like, that sounds like a lot of work. No's.
Yeah.
And I realized that at Microsoft, and you've worked at big companies before, it's not that you email someone and they're not interested in the topic. It's that you just gave them a to do, and they don't
Right.
know you and they don't want your to do. So my strategy this time was to email some vice presidents and say, I need you to tell me this is not a bad idea, and I will take care of everything. So I
Right.
emailed a
Right.
bunch of VPs, and then one of them said, and this is true story. They said, "I am supportive of this initiative." So I screenshotted that, and I started saying I
Mhm.
was talking to so and so, and they're supportive of this initiative. Screenshot, and that was the little cudgel that I would bonk them on the head with. And every time someone got close to saying no, I'd say, "But they're supportive of this initiative. Help me, help you." And then we started getting motion, and I realized that it wasn't about the no; it was about the laziness and the focus, because it's not going to do anything for
Yeah.
Microsoft. They don't care, right? Just
Yeah.
work.
And yeah, I think fundamentally that's kind of like part of why we were able to get it open source was basically it's like there's absolutely no reason for Microsoft to care about this. But if people put in the time to actually get it open sourced, it's nothing but free publicity. Just like this thing that was a while ago that some people really wanted, guess
Mm-hmm.
what? It's free now. And, now people can play with it. And, that's going to do nothing but good, good for Microsoft. So it's like, but it was the work.
It was the work, right? So then you and I were kind of back channeling and thinking about like, okay, we got this far. What should we do here? What should we do there? And step one, find the thing. Now,
Mm-hmm.
had you had any source before? Were there any like copies out there somewhere or leaked pieces of the source?
No, but what had happened before, which had given me a lot of confidence and a lot of optimism about this, is I think it was it Max Sample. I
Mm-hmm.
talked to them beforehand because every once in a while I would ask some people like hey, you work at Microsoft, can you just at least like look and tell me, do you still have this code? Because like if you've lost it, I'm going to stop asking. If it died on a server migration 20 years ago, well, nothing to do. But I was asking several people, and they would often go and just sort of look like, no, I checked the source servers, it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be somewhere else, and they didn't really know where else. So I think it was Mac who kind of finally went and looked and found the right place and was like, yep, it's there. Just not necessarily an obvious place. So just knowing it existed kind of made me a little more bold about asking for it because it's like, I know you've got it. That's the first step to being able to give it to me.
Yeah. So internally at Microsoft, a long time ago, I've been here now 14 years, there was a folder that was like / products. And it was literally just a share with everything. And then if you wanted a copy of money, you'd go and get it. But that was just the binaries. And then they moved all the old stuff into another / boneyard. So then you would go to Boneyard and you could find 3D Movie Maker, you could find, the old stuff. And then one day Boneyard disappeared and then products disappeared. And it turns out that there's a software archivist, and that when projects shut down, you're supposed to give your archives to the archivist, and the archivist does the archival stuff. I don't know who they are. There's an alias that I write to. And then I said, hey, do you have this on tape, on reel to reel, on whatever old format you have? And they said, I need a business justification. And then again, this is where you get stuck and you're like, I mean, because Foone said nicely, like, what's my business justification, right? So then it was like, I am supportive of this initiative. So then
exactly.
I said, we're exploring the option of the possibilities of the maybe of the releasing of this. And they're like, that's cool. If they're supportive. And then we had source. But then we started bumping into other things, because you pointed out early on that there are pieces of software, like we can't just say, here's Microsoft money, because there's third parties, there's codecs, there's different stuff.
Right.
What are some of the dependencies? What's the dependency chain underneath Microsoft 3D Movie Maker that would cause us problems to open source it?
Well, there's the main thing that was the big stumbling block was the Argonaut's blazing render engine, Brender, which was written by Argonaut, a games company. They used it in a bunch of their games. They sold it to a bunch of other companies, and it never was open sourced. It was always a closed source, SDK. It was kind of in the era when DirectX was starting to exist, but hadn't really caught on yet. Like, it was used for some DOS games and then some early Windows games kind of thing, where it was like, it was a nice software renderer, and then later it added on some abilities to let you plug in a renderer, prior to DirectX just being sort of the common, option for everything. It was like, yeah, we've got a driver you can plug in if you've got a Mystique card or an S3 card or a, 3DFX card, back when that was a complete nightmare to, get working. But it was, it was a nice sort of middleware for that. But that one actually turned out to be like one of the easiest parts, and it helped a lot of people outside of the people who were interested in 3D Movie Maker, just because Jez Sand, the former CEO of Argonaut, just sort of showed up to that thread and was like, "Yeah, I'd love to open source it," which was the best thing to say. He also just said, "But I don't have it anymore," and I got to sort of reply and go, "That's great, I've got it. Can I open source it?" So yeah. That was just a very sort of nice, serendipity, things coming together. Someone had leaked me a copy of it several years back, and I didn't know it yet, but there was someone else who'd been working on a copy of Brender that, like, it probably came from the same leak, but like they'd been, modding it and forking it to like add OpenGL support and things like that. So it was like the code was around. They had lost it, but just the fact it was still existing somewhere is not necessarily 100% legally, meant that it was possible to sort of give it the blessing to, release it.
Right, and we didn't even know Jez Sand was on Twitter or active. I don't know if Jez is retired or chilling or working on games. I don't know. But then just out of nowhere, they replied to you and they're like, "Hey, that's cool." And then, of course, you and I had to chase them down on email, and a little bit of like, "Hey, we just need you to say it's cool." Hey,
Yeah.
And then we finally got the cool, and it turns out you ended up with about 3 different versions of Brender, brender.
Yeah. Because there was the version that got leaked to me actually was 2 separate versions. Because like it was the like untouched copy they had gotten, and then they had to modify it for the game that it was actually for. Because basically the source I got was one of the games that used it. So I basically had to. I could just release the unmodified one easily, but the modified one, I kind of had to back out a few changes and I had to go through and edit out a couple of bits that made it obvious which game it was, just because it's like, I don't necessarily want the programmer to possibly get in any trouble about this. And then it turns out like, there are other games that have used it. Some of those games have programmers who still happen to have the source. So like, once I had that thread saying, "Hey, I'm open sourcing, Brender, with permission from Jez Sand," someone said, "Yeah, I worked on Privateer 2, one of the Wing Commander spinoffs, and we use Brender. I think I still have the discs." And, they were able to just give me yet another copy. So I think we've got either 3 or 4. Like we've got the one from 3D Movie Maker, but that one was only like just the binaries. We didn't actually have the source there. We were kind of hoping the source was in there, but I think the Privateer one is very close to that because it was constantly evolving over its lifespan. They were basically rewriting it for every company that was asking, to add in new features and such. So
yeah,
we got a bunch of differing versions from various places.
Yeah, that's a great example of where folks don't realize how much work goes into this stuff. They see a tweet from you, and then a month later a tweet from me, and then a month later a tweet from you, like, "Yeah, I got it building," and all of the "why don't you just" gets kind of like hidden beneath that. A lot of work goes into this, so we figure out how to get those pieces out. There weren't a lot of third-party issues, which meant we didn't have to chase down a lot of companies. But then I was able to get Microsoft to do a read-only archive, non-building. Now, Mac Sample, who's a fan of yours and of retro software, is a Microsoft engineer who did a little bit of work to get it building and had to figure out modern compilers versus non-modern compilers. But we gave you a broken source drop, right? What state was it in?
So it was a little bit of a mess because like the development environment they were using back then was very odd by modern standards. Like, it was 3D Movie Maker was supposed to be a Windows 95 like launch day exclusive kind of thing. I don't necessarily know if it made that date. I just know it was planned to be one. Like the nailing down the exact release date of the software is kind of tricky. But of course they had to develop it before Windows 95 was done. So a lot of the work was done on like NT 3.5. And then they apparently had a Unix toolkit of some kind installed. Like, so the make files end up using some Unix utilities, not just Windows utilities, which is kind of odd, but it also turned out there were a couple files missing that we didn't realize at first. But because of like the Unix tools, like the make cleans didn't work, and we didn't necessarily realize that right away because of the issues with not being able to clean it. So it's like we thought we had the files, but really we just had like a copy cached inside of like a program database or an OBJ file. So it took a while to sort of get that sorted out, and there's still people working on it right now. They're trying to get it to work with like modern tools like CMake and CLang and such. But we've got it all finally, working now. It's just taken a little bit of trickery of like, we need to rewrite some of these make files so that they don't need, Unix utilities. We had to move some files around just so that they, wouldn't conflict and we wouldn't run into issues where we built it once and it half built, but when we try it differently, we're accidentally using some tools out of the previous build. We got several times where it kind of seemed like it was working, and then you'd hand it to someone else and they say, no, it doesn't work, because it turns out you're using cache files and didn't realize it.
Hey friends, this is Scott. I hope you're enjoying this chat with Foone as much as I am, but we are going to take a brief break, and we're going to have a chat with our sponsor. Our sponsor, Raygun, today makes shows like this possible. JD from Raygun, it seems like everyone's talking about DevOps, but I don't hear enough about error reporting, crash reporting, bucketing of your errors across applications. People are excited to build their software, but they don't seem as excited about getting that information at runtime about what went wrong. Why do you think that is?
I think there's just an overall maturity that's growing in the software industry. We look at things like CI and CD, and, I know both of us were using that almost 20 years ago, cobbled together with sellotape and bubble gum, and now it's the stock standard way you'd build software. We think the same thing about telemetry and understanding how users are engaging. It's a growing area. A lot of folks that do come on with Raygun, they're not coming from an existing solution. They're just modernizing how they manage their software.
Absolutely. My applications were crashing and I didn't even know they were happening. They were crashing and restarting. They were poofing on iPhone. They would crash and recycle on websites. And then I plugged in Raygun and I get error, crash, and performance monitoring in a couple of lines of code, no matter whether I'm using Swift or I'm using C#. It was absolutely amazing stuff.
Yep, you can even measure the quality based on each individual deployment as well. So are you tracking in the right direction? All software does have faults. Nobody ever wonders if Raygun is actually working. Trust me, you'll know it's working. But yeah, are we going in the right direction is sometimes the most important thing to understand.
Are we going in the right direction? That is a great way to put it. And that's a great way that Raygun will allow you to understand, is my software getting better? I can actually tell you at runtime that it is having fewer crashes and better customer experiences. And customers who are listening to our podcast right now can sign up for a trial at raygun.com. This was an interesting time as we moved from like 92 to 95, as we were going from 16-bit to 32-bit. I wrote a bunch of thunking code to use 32-bit libraries within using 16-bit libraries rather within 32-bit processes. This is a 32-bit app, correct?
Yeah. The main app seems to be 32-bit through and through. There is some 16-bit code, I think, but it's in like the setup program, which no one's looked into all that seriously. I think we might be missing some files, but we're not terribly worried about that, basically, because that was one of the sticking points of getting the original program to install in the modern day, is that like the installer won't work on modern systems. So it's like, if we're going to have an installer, we're going to need to basically just make our own. They're modern installer programs. We can build it on top of one of those. Right. But for now, what we've done basically is sort of taken out the requirement for an installer, because really all it needs is a couple registry keys telling it like it's been installed here, so it knows where to find the files. So I did a really quick patch. It's like, hey, if you look for the registry key and it's not there, just assume it's in the current directory, which let me just give everyone a zip file. And it's like, yep, here you go. It's done. It's working.
So I put a TikTok up and I said, hey, we did this thing and it's cool. And a lot of questions, because I made a throwaway statement that I thought was obvious. I said, we can learn a lot from how folks wrote code back then. And people in the comments said, well, what can we learn? All right, nothing good came out of that era. What can we learn about how people wrote C and C++ and a little inline assembler 27 years ago?
Well, yeah, the inline assembler is definitely a very interesting one, because like the code actually has inline assembler for a lot of the functions, and then a separate C implementation of it. It seems to be that 3D Movie Maker itself doesn't seem to have ever been intended to run on Macs, but it's built on a library that did run on Macs, which I think was used for like Creative Writer and Fine Artist, which are two other Microsoft Home programs, which did have Mac ports. So I think those parts, they just said, well, we make a C version and that'll compile everywhere. But for, PCs, we'll make an inline assembler one because it'll run so much faster. And that's one of the things that's really changed over time. It's like compilers have gotten a lot better, so you don't need to resort to inline assembler as much. Plus, if you're making portable stuff, you kind of can't without having to write a bunch of implementations. But kind of the thing that struck me the most, like looking at the C++ code, is it's compared to sort of modern stuff, it seems incredibly like defensive. Like it is constantly error checking and has a lot of sort of, handling this resource and then manually, handling, freeing it when we run it into an error message. It's kind of things that, as C++ has evolved since then, they've gotten a lot more automatic. There are things like, we've got, like automatic typing, and then, smart pointers and things. So it's not required to be as defensive, but this code it kind of reads like C++ written by someone who's really more at home in C. Like I don't think there's any exceptions being used in it. And it's like, other than the fact it uses classes, it's very sort of C code. Like there's a lot of, try this. If that fails, go to error handle. There's a lot of error go-tos all over it. So it's interesting to sort of look at that. It's like a lot of modern software kind of would benefit from being written a little more defensively. It would probably run a bit better, but it's like back then you kind of had to write it that way or it wouldn't work at all.
I love that you noticed that, and I think your analysis is really spot on and thoughtful, because in the 90s, when we were writing code like that, it was like using a computer and writing code for a computer, especially on Windows, was tiptoeing through a minefield. So you'd do a thing and you'd reassert the thing. And you'd do a thing and you'd make 2 or 3 checks to make sure, is this pointer where I think it should be? Because you were writing to there was no concept of like process protection or memory protection. You poke something in the wrong place and you overwrite outside your process space, and like, YOLO, and things go bad. And during that time, as we went from Windows 3.1, which had 0 process protection, to Windows 95, moving between 16-bit and 32-bit, it was a time of paranoia. So I hope that means that it's decent code, but I wonder if it's like reading Old English, like we speak modern English, but we're reading an old poem of idiomatic Old English.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. It kind of like I used to be a Java programmer, and it's like Java is a very boilerplate heavy language, and some of it kind of feels like that, where it's like there's a lot of very explicit, like, create this and then create this based on that, then create this based on that, and then carefully make sure you destruct them all in the correct order, kind of thing, where it's like this could be a lot simpler, but I can kind of understand why it was written this way. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's kind of interesting about how it was written is that like there's a lot of use of like very, very short abbreviations. And in a way that kind of makes me think you didn't have things like, code completion or like IntelliSense and such, where it's like, I posted some screenshots on it where I was kind of making fun of some of the things where it's like a GG is made of GLs, and a GL is also can be used as an AST, which is a type of AG. And it's like, could you use names? Just stop using letters. Like if you called this a generic list and then like a string array or a string tree and stuff, yep, this would be a lot easier to understand. But it's kind of, you look at it, it's like you're just smashing the keyboard every time you need a type. Plus, without modern IntelliSense, you got to use Hungarian notation to know what types things are. And as someone who doesn't do a lot of Hungarian notation coding, it can look like you named your variable, but you also smashed some keys at the beginning of it. So yeah, it's kind of amusing to see that.
I get into trouble even today using what's called Hungarian notation. You make that reference. Hungarian notation is the idea of putting types or many types at the beginning of the name of the variable. So you would end up with an LP, CZ, CSZ, STR called foo. And it's right, like, it's a long pointer to a null terminated string, and everything means something. The Z means null terminated in the LP. So we would end up with this ridiculous acronym soup, but it was created by a Hungarian who was very much a fan of it, and it dominated the 90s.
Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense when you don't have, these kind of modern IDEs that can just tell you at a glance what type that variable is. It's kind of a way to sort of do that manually. And, it clearly worked. I mean, like this software does, is doing a good job of keeping track of all these different types. And I imagine it was a lot easier to program because they were so good about making sure that like what type things was always written in the variable name, so you could easily tell, and you can just edit this code in Notepad or, something only slightly better than Notepad. Mm-hmm. Without needing a complicated IDE that keeps track of all these things, because that didn't really exist in 1994.
So you forked the read-only archive. It's now on your GitHub, and you released a 0.1 zip file that can be unzipped and run in place called 3D Movie Maker Forever. How did you build it? Did you use a combination of old tools and modern tools? And how are you going to decide, like, what's your goal? Is your goal to just like git clone and type configure and make and it'll run, or what's your ultimate goal there?
So Yeah, shortly after I got open source, I did a thread sort of explaining my kind of long-term goals on it. The sort of first one is basically to make something I called Chocolate 3D Movie Maker at first, because I'm kind of patterning a lot of this sort of open source stuff after Doom, which is kind of, I think, like sort of the poster child of something that was originally closed source, then became open source and was very much like adopted by the community, as something that has a lot of forks and, they all work together kind of thing. And there's a program called Chocolate Doom, which is basically, it's a pun on vanilla Doom. It's like, it's not vanilla Doom as in the original PC Doom for MS-DOS, but it's as close as you can get on a modern like Windows or Linux or Mac system. So the idea is that I'm going to make a chocolate 3D movie maker, which is the thing I'm calling 3D MIM forever. It's basically, I'm just going to take the program, get it building on modern systems, and then fix some bugs that have shown up over the years. It's like, not bugs that were there in the first place, or limitations that were there in the first place, just the kind of things like, it now runs in windowed mode instead of full screen because the NT like API changed. And it's like, sometime around 2000, everyone was like, how come it's running windowed now instead of full screen? It just, because now you're on NT, you didn't think about it with XP and such, things like that. And then, making a new installer, making it easier to run, just sort of if you want to just play with it for nostalgia reasons, this is the thing to go for. And then once I've got that, working and building, the idea is that I'm going to fork that, fork my own fork and make one that's kind of the, improved version, which I'm going to call like 3D Movie Maker Plus. Similarly to like Doom, where there's things like GZ Doom and Z Doom and all these sort of add-ons where they don't just make a Doom that runs on Windows. They also put in a 3D renderer instead of the whole 2D, 2.5D thing going on back then. They put in things where like it's much easier to script it now, so you can make custom levels that are better. Your custom levels can use like full color textures, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of doing much like the original one did, but removing a lot of the limitations that it had. Things like, it runs in 256 color mode. That should be pretty easy to, modify out. It should be pretty easy to make it, 3D accelerated, and having options like being able to export it out to like, an MP4 file so you can put it onto YouTube. Because up until now, the way you put a 3D Movie Maker movie on YouTube is you have to set it up just right and get like OBS or Bandicam or something to copy the right part of the screen. And you got to make sure it's copying sound too, which is kind of tricky because it uses MIDI, which also doesn't kind of work that well anymore. So we're going to put in a soft synth. That's all complicated. It'd be much nicer to just have a save as, because that's one of the things about it that kind of has limited its ability to sort of spread far and wide, is that the way it works is it saves out a file that's basically just sort of a script. It's telling, and I mean that not in the computer programming sense, in the play sense. It's like, this actor appears here, this actor appears there, this actor, in the next frame walks to here, and that character does that. We play this sound effect. It's just a list of what happens when, which makes the movie files incredibly tiny. And in the 90s, you've got dial-up, you've got floppy disks. It was perfect for that. You could make a movie that's 10 minutes long, and it's like, yeah, it's 100 kilobytes. You can stick it on floppy and hand it to a friend. But in the modern day, you want to be able to just click a link and watch it. So being able to export it would be great. One of the sort of long-term goals that would be really cool is to sort of get it to run in the browser using WebAssembly, so that you could easily just be like, yeah, go to this 3dmim.tv site, and it just pops up a version of it in the browser and plays it directly. That would be really great, but we have a lot of work to do before we can get there.
So do you encourage folks to come to your GitHub and jump in and get involved? Or they put in issues? What's the best way that someone can help you? They can go to your Patreon, they can take a look at foone.org, but how can someone get involved in the most positive way?
We've got a Discord that is kind of where most of the organizing is going on for this right now. Basically, there was already a project called Open 3DMM. Basically, someone just sort of doing some reverse engineering from scratch and implementing their own software that was going to sort of act like 3D Movie Maker. And much like other projects like that, like I did one back in the early 2000s, it had kind of stalled out a bit and hasn't been making a lot of progress. But basically, because that already existed and already had kind of a community, it was sort of the perfect place to sort of come in and take over and say like, okay, now we're going to be talking about the open source release with permission of the owner, of course. So yeah, there's a Discord. I need to put the link to it up in like the README file. I haven't actually done that yet, but yeah, it's sort of people coming in and talking about, what they're working on, sort of things. Like right now, a lot of it is just sort of working on getting it to build with modern tools. Because it's like, you can get it in building just fine now, but we still have one closed source library we haven't been able to replace. And you need Visual Studio 2.1. 2.0 is too old, 2.2 is too new. It has to be exactly 2.1. So it's like, unless you're willing to go find some 1994 compiler stuff, it's kind of a pain to compile it right now. So a lot of people working on like getting it to build with modern Visual Studio with CMake instead of the sort of hobbled together in-make files we've got, in the original repo. So I think once we've got we've gotten over some of the initial build stuff, and it's a lot easier to build it and test it and play with it, there's going to be a lot more, effort in adding new features and modernizing it.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Foone Turing, software necromancer, who's making it happen for the 3D movie maker community. I'm happy to have been able to unblock us and play a tiny role in your life's work, and you got that done. And now all the real work begins, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was saying on Twitter, it's like, I'm going to be working on this for years. So, there's no reason to rush.
That makes me happy. Well, fantastic. The internet appreciates your work and your service. We've been chatting with Foone Turing. You can check Foone out at foone.org or on Twitter, twitter.com/Foone. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.